My name is Talia. I never expected that the moment I finally let myself laugh in my own family's backyard would become the moment everything broke. It happened at my mother's birthday gathering at my parents' home in the Pennsylvania suburbs. The yard was full of relatives who had not seen each other in months. Conversations overlapped, glasses clinked, and I allowed myself to relax for the first time in a long while. I was telling a light story to a small group near the patio. People were smiling, responding, leaning in. I felt seen, not like someone taking up too much space. That was when my sister walked over. She didn't say my name. She didn't ask me to lower my voice. She didn't even try to hide the irritation in her face. She looked directly at me and told me I was being too loud. Before I could respond, her hand struck my cheek hard enough that the world froze for a second. Conversation stopped. Glasses halted midair. My father let out a short laugh. My mother followed with a smile that was almost pleased. I heard the words clearly. She deserved that. No one realized that the microphone set up near the birthday cake table was already on. Every sound, every word, every breath had been captured. If you believe no one deserves to be humiliated for simply existing, stay with me. What happened next changed everything. From a young age, I learned that silence was the first rule in our house. I do not remember anyone saying it directly, but the expectation settled around me like the thick summer air in our neighborhood, slow and heavy and impossible to ignore. I was the kind of child who spoke when I felt something, who asked questions, who laughed when something was funny instead of waiting to see if others found it acceptable. My parents did not seem to appreciate that. They never yelled or punished me harshly for it, but I could always feel their disapproval, the tightening in their jaw, or the brief pause before responding to me, the subtle suggestion that I should tone myself down for the sake of peace. My sister Claudia fit the atmosphere of our home perfectly. She mastered quiet smiles, polite nods, the controlled tone that adults praised as maturity. If I expressed excitement, Claudia was calm. If I cried, Claudia appeared composed. If I raised my voice out of joy, Claudia lowered hers and earned a compliment for being so graceful. I do not think she did these things out of malice. She simply learned early that our parents rewarded stillness. They wanted a daughter who reflected a certain image, one they could present to relatives and friends without fear of judgment. Claudia was that daughter. I was not. My parents never told me I was too much. Yet I felt it every time I entered a room. When I spoke, conversations seemed to shift direction. When I laughed, heads turned slightly. When I shared ideas, I was encouraged to think before speaking, even when I already had. None of this happened loudly. It was always subtle, a raised eyebrow or a well-rehearsed sigh from Dad, a soft but dismissive smile from Mom. At birthday dinners, holiday gatherings, or school events, Claudia stood beside them like a photograph of everything they wanted others to see, while I hovered just outside the frame. As I got older, I began to teach myself to shrink. I learned to soften my voice and limit my reactions. I rehearsed my thoughts before speaking, sometimes to the point where I said nothing at all. Teachers would tell my parents that I was quiet and reserved, and my parents would smile with satisfaction, believing I had matured. In reality, I was simply adapting to survive the emotional climate of my family. I was learning that existing gently would create fewer ripples, and fewer ripples meant fewer disappointed glances. Claudia continued to be admired for her composure. She was praised for her ability to say the right words at the right time. When relatives visited, Mom would invite them to watch Claudia play the piano while I was asked to help in the kitchen. I convinced myself that stepping back was easier than trying to claim space that no one seemed willing to offer. I kept telling myself that if I could just be a little quieter, a little smaller, everything would be fine. Years later, when I moved out for college, the distance felt like fresh air, but patterns learned in childhood rarely vanish quickly. I continued to take up as little space as possible, even when no one was there to ask it of me. Yet when Mom called about the birthday gathering, her tone made it clear that attendance was not a suggestion. It was an obligation. She did not ask if I could come. She simply said that I needed to be there, as if I were returning to fulfill a role I had never asked to play. I agreed without hesitation, the old instinct rising before I could stop it. That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house. The sky was a muted blue, the kind that feels suspended, neither bright nor gloomy. The closer I got, the more familiar everything felt, as if my body remembered this route better than my mind wanted it to. I parked in front of the house I grew up in, where the lawn was always trimmed with precision, and the walkway had been repainted every summer without fail. It looked exactly the same as when I was younger, which made something in my chest tighten. The gathering was set up in the backyard. Fold-out tables covered with light fabric held trays of food, pitchers of lemonade, and a cake that sat untouched under a plastic cover. Guests stood in small groups talking with a kind of pleasant rhythm. The kind of scene that would appear warm and welcoming to anyone on the outside. I moved through it carefully, staying aware of how much space I took up, how my steps sounded on the pavement, and where I placed my hands. Old habits rose without invitation. Claudia moved through the yard with the ease of someone who believed the event belonged to her. She adjusted centerpieces, spoke to guests with practiced politeness, and made sure every small detail aligned the way she imagined it should. She was not the host yet. Her presence shaped the entire atmosphere. People looked to her the way one naturally looks toward the person in charge, even when no one officially named her as such. Her husband, Cole, stood near the drink table greeting relatives who approached him. He had always been kind in a steady, understated way. There was no forced cheerfulness, only measured conversation, and a sense of someone who watched more than he spoke. When he saw me, he smiled in a way that felt genuine rather than obligatory. He asked how I had been, and the question felt like it came from a place of true interest. I answered simply, not eager to say much, but not feeling dismissed either. I tried to blend into the background. I spoke softly when someone addressed me. I kept my laughter small. Yet as the afternoon went on, I found myself in a conversation with a cousin I had not seen in years. She told a story about something ridiculous that happened at work, and the image she painted was so vivid that I laughed before I could think about it. It was not loud or disruptive. It was just natural. A moment of ease. A moment where I allowed myself to exist without calculation. When I laughed, I felt Claudia's eyes on me. It was not dramatic or obvious. It was a small shift in her expression, a tightening near her mouth, a glance that lasted just long enough to be felt. She did not say anything. She did not need to. I recognized the message instantly. That laugh took up too much space. That laugh reminded her of the version of me she believed needed to be managed. I lowered my voice again. I stepped slightly backward. I reminded myself to observe the air around me before entering it. The conversation continued, but something inside me had already curled back into itself. Cole came closer at one point, standing near Claudia without saying much. He observed the room the way he always did, with quiet attention. I noticed his eyes move between Claudia and me, as if he sensed something beneath the surface. But he did not interfere. He never had, and I never expected him to. He existed beside Claudia, not within the deeper layers that had shaped us before he arrived. The evening moved forward with smooth, practiced politeness, yet I could feel tension building like heat beneath a closed door. It was silent, heavy, and waiting. By the middle of the gathering, the atmosphere began to shift. Conversations continued, plates were being refilled, and music played at a volume designed to blend into the background rather than draw attention. Yet something subtle changed in the way people interacted. I could feel it even before anything was said. It was the same familiar tightening I had learned to recognize long ago, the sense that my presence was brushing against invisible boundaries. I found myself telling a light story to a small group near the patio. It was not dramatic or attention-seeking, just a memory from a college event, something harmless that had made me laugh when I thought about it earlier that week. The people around me responded kindly. Their shoulders relaxed, their faces softened, and the laughter came easily. It felt natural without pretense. For a moment, I forgot to monitor myself. Claudia moved closer to the group, though she did not join it. She stood at a slight angle listening while pretending not to listen. Her expression did not change much, yet a tension gathered in the corners of her eyes. She waited until I finished a sentence before stepping forward, not to contribute but to redirect. She offered a correction about a minor detail that did not matter. Then she shifted the topic to something she believed more appropriate, something that positioned her as the one guiding the flow of conversation. I stepped back slightly, allowing space. I did not want to challenge her. I told myself it was easier to let her hold the center since that was the role she had always taken. But someone asked me a question directly, something related to the story I had begun. I answered simply. The response prompted another laugh. It was small, warm, unforced. Claudia's eyes met mine. There was no open anger in them, only the cold sharpness of someone who believed they had been undermined. She spoke to me with a gentle tone that did not match the message beneath it. She told me that I was getting carried away again, the same phrase that had followed me throughout childhood. I replied quietly that I did not think that was the case. The words were calm, measured, and free of challenge. To Claudia, that calmness was the offense. She saw it not as peace, but as performance. She believed I was trying to appear composed in a way that would make her look unreasonable. The moment stretched. It was small, nearly invisible to others, yet heavy enough to shift the air. She stepped closer, too close for a casual interaction. Her voice dropped lower, yet not enough to go unheard. She told me I always tried to draw attention, that I always disrupted the atmosphere, that even now I could not simply exist without making everything about myself. Before I could respond, her hand struck my cheek. The contact was sharp, precise, and final. The sound of it cut through conversation, silenced movement, and held the attention of every person present. My face burned, but I did not lift my hand to it. I stayed still. Dad let out a short laugh. Mom smiled with a satisfaction that struck me deeper than the slap. Mom said I deserved it. Dad agreed without hesitation. No one realized that the microphone positioned near the small makeshift stage was already turned on. Every sound carried through the portable speaker system. The slap, Mom's voice, Dad's approval. All of it stretched into the quiet yard and settled into the silence that followed. I did not try to explain. I did not try to defend myself. I stood there letting the moment exist exactly as it had happened. The truth had finally spoken without me saying a word. I walked away from the backyard and stood alone under the covered porch. The air felt thick, not from tears or humiliation, but from the effort of keeping myself steady. I focused on my breathing, slow and quiet, so no one could say I was making a scene or trying to gain sympathy. I had learned that composure was the only shield I ever truly owned in that house. Footsteps approached behind me. I did not turn because I thought it might be Claudia, ready to finish what she had started. Instead, I heard a familiar voice, gentle in a way that made my throat tighten. It was my cousin Jamie. He had always been the one relative who watched rather than joined, who listened rather than judged. He stepped beside me without pushing for attention, almost as if he had rehearsed how to take up as little emotional space as possible. He told me that the microphone had been on the entire time. The one used for speeches and small family announcements sat on a nearby stand, picking up every word, every breath, and every impact. Not only the slap, but also the sentence from my parents that followed. Jamie lifted his phone and said he had pressed record when he noticed tension building at the table. He did not record to expose anyone. He recorded because, as he put it, I knew no one would believe you if it came to your word against hers. The sentence settled into my chest with a weight that felt strange. It was not pain. It was recognition. Recognition that someone had seen me, truly seen me, for the first time in years. Jamie handed the phone to me. I listened to the recording once. The laughter stung far more than the slap. The sound of my own silence afterward sounded like something breaking. I thanked Jamie. He did not offer comfort or pity. He simply nodded as if the situation required stillness rather than reaction. He returned to the backyard not to defend me but to maintain the neutrality that kept him safe in the family. I understood that too well to resent it. I walked to my car. I did not look back. I did not say goodbye. No one noticed I had left, or if they did not care enough to call after me. The road away from that house felt familiar, like the dozens of quiet exits I had made during childhood arguments and holiday tensions. Yet something felt different this time. I was not leaving to avoid conflict. I was leaving because the truth was now in my pocket. I drove to the apartment of my best friend Maya. She opened the door before I knocked all the way, as if she already knew. She did not ask what happened. I sat on her couch. She waited until my breathing evened out. There were no dramatic gestures, no promises of revenge, no exaggerated sympathy meant to warm the wound. She simply existed beside me, and that was enough to remind me that I had not lost my voice entirely. When I finally told her what had happened, she listened with a stillness that made each word feel heavier and more real. I played the recording for her. When it ended, she did not gasp. She did not curse my family. She only looked at me for a long moment, and her voice was firm, almost steady enough to carry me. She said, "From now on, you are not allowed to shrink yourself anymore." The sentence did not comfort me. It restructured me. I sat back and held the phone in both hands. The proof was real. The moment was real. The choice was mine now. For the first time, I did not feel like a child hiding in a quieter version of myself. I felt like someone standing at the edge of something unspoken but necessary. I was not going back. A few days later, I listened to the recording. I had avoided it at first, because I thought it would only remind me of the sting on my cheek. I believed the pain was physical and temporary. When I finally played it through my headphones in my apartment, I understood how wrong I had been. The sound did not begin with the moment of the slap. It began long before that, in the laughter rising throughout the backyard, in the small comments that slipped under the surface of every interaction. I heard the way Claudia's tone shifted whenever I spoke, the slight lift of her voice that suggested patience stretched thin. I heard Mom's quiet amusement when I tried to soften the situation. I heard Dad's agreement disguised as humor. Then the slap arrived, but it was almost gentle compared to what followed. The words were what cut the deepest. The recording caught the moment Mom said that I deserved it. Her voice was clear and unbothered, as if the judgment had been formed long before that afternoon. The laughter that followed felt familiar, something that had echoed in different forms throughout my childhood. I sat still while the recording continued. I did not cry. I barely moved. I realized I was not reacting to a single event. I was confronting a pattern that had shaped every quiet part of my life. It became obvious that I had spent years shrinking myself to avoid becoming a problem. I had spoken softly, measured my words, adjusted my laugh, and waited for approval that never arrived. Claudia had not slapped me because I was loud at a party. She had done it because my existence had always been something she needed to contain. The recording forced me to see that the rules had been set long before either of us understood them. Claudia was allowed to be centered. I was expected to disappear. The next morning, Claudia sent a message. It did not mention the slap. It did not mention the cruel statement. She wrote that she hoped I had reflected on my behavior and that I could return to the family space with maturity. The wording sounded rehearsed, the kind of message sent when someone is confident that others will support their version of the truth. A few hours later, Mom texted as well. She spoke about preserving peace and avoiding embarrassment. She said nothing about the harm. I stared at the messages for several minutes before locking my phone. I did not reply. I did not explain myself. I did not defend my character. I chose silence because for the first time, Silence belonged to me. That week, I made an appointment with a therapist. During the first session, I explained that I felt like I had been living in a room without enough air. The therapist listened without forcing conclusions. She said that I had learned survival through invisibility, and that unlearning it would take patience. She did not encourage confrontation or reconciliation. She encouraged presence. She asked me to notice what my voice sounded like when I was not bracing for impact. In the following days, I realized how heavy I had been carrying myself. I began practicing small acts of expansion. I spoke without waiting for permission. I laughed without monitoring volume. I allowed myself to exist without apology. I did not respond to Claudia or to Mom. The absence of a reply was heard louder than any explanation I could have written. I did not need to argue. I did not need to justify. My silence was no longer the silence they taught me. It was the silence I chose. The following week, the recording began to circulate among extended family. I did not send it to anyone. Jamie had only given it to me, and Maya had respected my space completely. Yet families have their own invisible circulatory systems carried through whispers, group chats, and the subtle urgency of shared judgment. One cousin passed it to another, then a distant aunt requested it, and within a few days nearly everyone in the family had heard it. I did not track its path. I only saw the effects. At first, the family group chat went strangely quiet. Silence settled where there had once been performative warmth. Then, individual messages arrived. A few people apologized, though their apologies came with confessions rather than clarity. One cousin wrote that she had always felt that Claudia took up all the space in a room, but she never wanted to say it out loud. Another said she remembered how I was told to lower my voice at every holiday dinner, even when I was barely speaking. These were not revelations. They were acknowledgments people had avoided making for years. Still hearing them offered a strange form of validation. Not comfort, but recognition. Claudia's husband did not send me a message at first. His silence felt different. In the recording, his voice had not appeared often. He had not laughed. He had not intervened. He had stood somewhere between neutrality and distance. A few days later, I noticed subtle changes. On social media, he stopped posting pictures that included Claudia. Then family members mentioned that he had begun staying longer at work, returning home late, avoiding shared plans. I heard these things secondhand, but they aligned with something I had sensed before. Cole had always been kind in a quiet and consistent way. He had never told me to lower my volume. He had never looked at me with the exhausted patience Claudia did. His silence now was not avoidance. It was consideration. My parents reacted differently. When people began asking questions, they did not reflect. They retaliated. Mom called me first, saying that I had embarrassed her and disrupted the unity of the family. She did not mention the slap. She did not mention her own words in the recording. She said I had disrespected her by allowing others to interpret what happened without context. Dad followed later that evening. His voice was stern and steady, as though he believed this could still be handled with authority. He said that families must accept imperfections and forgive without dwelling on mistakes. He said that refusing to return to the group chat made me cruel. I listened without responding. I felt the familiar pull to defend myself, to explain, to soften the edges of the truth so they could digest it. I let that instinct pass. They insisted that my silence was the problem. They said that I was the one breaking the family apart. I realized in that moment that this was the script they had always relied on. If I made myself small, everything stayed smooth. If I claimed any space at all, I became the threat. This pattern was not new. The only new element was that I no longer accepted it. I did not argue. I did not apologize. I did not explain that I had not shared the recording. I simply said that I needed space. Mom said space was selfish. Dad said space was dramatic. I said goodbye and ended the call. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, not empty, but peaceful in a way I had never experienced within my family. I attended therapy sessions and began noticing how my body reacted when I allowed myself to speak without restraint. I slept without tension in my shoulders. I laughed without checking the volume. I understood that the consequences unfolding were not mine to control. They belonged to the truth that had finally surfaced. I had always been told that silence kept peace. Now silence became the line that protected me. A month later, I received a message from Cole. It was brief and careful, saying he wanted to speak with me alone, that the conversation was not on behalf of Claudia or my parents, and that he understood if I chose not to reply. I agreed to meet because I no longer reacted out of guilt or anger. I simply wanted closure. We met in a quiet cafe tucked behind a row of old townhouses. Cole sat already waiting, his posture slightly hunched, his hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold. His face looked tired in a way I had never seen before, as if the weight he carried had finally settled where he could feel it. When I sat down, he did not waste time forming polite introductions. His voice was steady but lined with regret, and he began with an apology that did not try to excuse itself. He said he had listened to the recording many times, not once, not twice, but enough times that the tone of every word had carved itself into him. He said he realized that what happened at the party was not a sudden outburst from Claudia, but the visible surface of something that had been present for years. He admitted that he had watched it happen before, not in public like that day, but in smaller moments that he convinced himself were harmless. He told himself that siblings teased each other, that families had complicated rhythms, that it was not his place to intervene. Only now did he understand that his silence had meaning. His silence gave permission. Cole said he could no longer defend the life he had been living. He had already spoken to a lawyer. He was separating from Claudia. His voice did not tremble, but there was a loneliness in his eyes that came from realizing he had stayed too long in a place where he never actually belonged either. I listened, not searching for vindication and not offering comfort. When he finished, I told him I was not angry anymore. Anger requires attachment, and mine had ended. I told him that I appreciated his honesty, but it changed nothing about what I needed for my own life. I told him that from this moment forward, I did not consider myself part of that family. I was not leaving in protest. I was stepping out because I had finally remembered I was allowed to exist without permission. After that day, I blocked Claudia and my parents. No farewell messages, no dramatic declarations, just silence, clean and complete. I moved to a new city near the coast where mornings smelled like salt and the horizon felt wide enough for a beginning. I filled my home with music light and the sound of my own voice spoken softly aloud. I learned the shape of peace not as something earned, but as something reclaimed. I did not win anything. I simply walked away, and that was enough. No one is obliged to become smaller so someone else can feel significant. Sometimes the only way to protect your dignity is to remove yourself from the places that taught you to hide your voice. Healing is not always loud or dramatic. It can be the quiet refusal to return to those who diminished you. Letting go may feel like losing something permanent, but often it is only releasing what was never love in the first place. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Your time here matters. I want to ask you something sincerely. If you were in my position, would you remain silent to preserve harmony, or would you speak and walk away to protect your self-worth? There is no easy answer, and every person carries their own history. Share your thoughts. Your voice deserves space too.